Odo of Cluny was the second abbot of Cluny. He enacted various reforms in the Cluniac system of France and Italy. He is venerated as a saint by the Catholic Church and Eastern Orthodox Church, and his feast day is the 18th of November. There is only one contemporary biography of him, the Vita Ordination, written by John of Salerno. Early life. Saint Odo was the son of Abba, a feudal lord of Deals, near Le Mans. Abba was a very devout man who would frequently recite the precepts of the gospel to those around him. According to Odo's later disciple John, before Odo was born, Abba went on his knees one Christmas in the middle of the night and asked God for the gift of a son, because he still had not had a son. His wife's name was Arenberger, and even though she was too old to bear children, she nevertheless became pregnant and gave birth to a son. According to the same source, when Odo was a baby, his father was fearful of the child's safety, and so one day when he found the baby alone, he took Odo up in his arms and prayed to Saint Martin of Tours, saying, "O gem of saints, receive this child." His father later sent Odo to receive education from a priest in a faraway district. This priest one day was visited by the apostles Peter and Paul, who demanded that the child be given to their service. And the priest was terrified by this apparition, and he begged the saints to let the boy free. Peter and Paul then said they would do so, but only for a time. The patron saints of Cluny Abbey were in fact Peter and Paul. When Odo became a teenager, his father saw how physically strong he was, and he felt like he had made the wrong decision by making him go into a career in the church and instead decided he should have a military career. His father then stopped his education and sent him to work as a page at the court of William the Pious, Duke of Aquitaine, where he passed his days in hunting and military exercises. However, Odo felt deeply dissatisfied with his life there, and when he was 16 he suffered so much that his father told him to pray to the saints for help. On Christmas Day he felt such deep reproach, like his life was not pleasing to Christ, and he then turned to the Virgin Mary, praying to her for help. But after he said this prayer he began to have a terrible pain in his head that continued for 3 years. Abba then remembered the prayer he had made to Saint Martin when his son was a baby, because he feared the baby would not survive. His son then grew up very healthy and strong, almost like it was an answer to the prayer. But his son was healthy, so much so that Abba then forgot his original prayer and put his son in a military career. But his son was now suffering so greatly. Abba felt like this was all a sign from Martin, and he prayed again to Martin, "Behold, what gratefully I offered exactly thou hast required. Truly as is fitting thou art quick to hear our vows, but expensive art thou in business." Abba then told Odo about the story, and Odo left William's court to go to Tours, the site of Martin's shrine, and he vowed to Martin that he would give himself to Martin's service. He then went to the monastery of Saint Martin of Tours to live a religious life as a canon. Monastery of Saint Martin. In the 9th and 10th centuries, the shrine of Saint Martin of Tours was treated as one of the holiest sites in Western Christendom. Huge numbers of pilgrims would come there every year to see the relics of Saint Martin. Many miracles were said to have occurred within the vicinity of the tomb. More than 150 years before Odo had come, when the Umayyad army came out of Spain to invade France. It was when they came to raid this shrine that the Franks, under Charles Martel, gave them a terrible defeat at the Battle of Tours. When Odo came there, however, he was very upset at what he saw. He claimed in later years that the monks and canons at Tours, who had been spoiled by all the wealth and gifts brought by the pilgrims, had abandoned the rule they were required to follow and were living in sin. The fact that such a thing was happening in such a holy place as Tours convinced Odo that this was a very grand sacrilege taking place. He later called it the abomination of desolation. Odo became a canon in Tours, and at first he lived the same way as the other canons. But after some time passed, he felt disgusted by it, and instead he disciplined himself and lived a very ascetic lifestyle. He would spend days in spiritual reading and nights in prayer. His reading, however, was not limited to spiritual books. He also read the poems of Virgil. This stopped when one night he had a vision and saw a vase which was beautiful, but inside of it was filled with serpents. He saw the book of Virgil inside of the vase, and he recognized that the serpents were the ideas of the poets. He then concluded that he should not study anything else except spiritual books. His asceticism at Tours was very strong, and he decided to give himself up completely to spiritual contemplation. He then went to a little cell about 2 miles from the tomb of Saint Martin, and every day he ate only a pound of bread and a handful of beans, as well as very little drink. He slept on the ground, and the door to his cell was left open as he slept. He slept in his clothes. Odo would later tell his monks at Cluny that the monks at Tours did not wear the habit any longer, but instead they wore colored garments, with flowing cowls and tunics, and even covered them with cloaks. The monks wore shoes that were colored and shining, and they would be afraid of getting these shoes dirty, so they wouldn't go out to the nightly lords. They no longer followed the rule of Saint Benedict, but they changed it and abandoned it according to their desires. It was from all these experiences that later motivated him to embrace the reform movement that had begun at Cluny by Brno. Odo's asceticism at Tours was the strongest period of asceticism in his life. Odo later related some miraculous interventions that he said he came in contact with at Tours. In one instance, during nightly lauds, when the monks with the shiny shoes did not want to go and do their prayers, a monk saw 2 men enter the dormitory, one carrying a sword and the other directing him. The one who directed him pointed out one monk after another in turn and said, "Strike," and the man then killed each monk in turn. The monk who watched them then begged God in prayer for his life, and the sword was withdrawn and the men then went away. In another instance, relating to the monks who refused to wear their habits any longer, Odo said that 2 monks from Tours were once sent on business outside of the monastery. One of the monks wore his habit and the other dressed like a layperson. The monk dressed as a layperson became fatally sick on his journey and he was about to die. But the other monk then had a vision in which he saw a vision of a throne in heaven with Saint Benedict sitting on top of it, surrounded by an army of monks. The dying monk was lying prostrate in front of the throne and was asking for help. Benedict then looked at the monk in the lay clothes and said that he did not seem to recognize this monk's habit and that he must have belonged to a different order. Benedict then said he could do nothing, because it was not within his powers to help those of another order or judge their lives. The dying monk dressed in lay clothes then was filled with despair at his doom. The other monk who kept his habit then took it off and wrapped it around the dying monk, and Benedict then healed the dying monk of his disease. Odo began to develop a reputation as being a very holy person. He did not like this attention, however, and so he went to Paris to study for a time under Remigius of Auxerre, before he returned to Tours. When Odo returned, the other canons at Tours asked him to write an abridgment of the Moralia of Gregory the Great, and Odo at first refused on grounds that he was not qualified, but then he had a vision of Pope Gregory coming down and telling him to write it, and so Odo then wrote it. Odo spent a total of 6 years at Tours. It was a meeting he had with a nobleman named Count Fuller, which began the steps that would lead him towards Cluny. Count Fuller had taken 2 golden vases from St. Martin's shrine and refused to give them back. He then got a serious illness and was going to die. The Count was then carried to Martin's tomb, where Odo said to him, "Give back, O wretch, the vases which thou stolest. Then only will St. Martin give thee back health." The Count then obeyed and gave back the vases. Count Fuller was then healed of his disease, and Odo told the Count that he should now become a monk. The Count felt like this was asking too much from him, but he told Odo that he would get a friend named Adhegranus to become a monk. Count Fuller then told his friend Attribution about this, and Attribution then gave up his military career, gave his possessions to the poor, shaved his head and dedicated himself to God. Several of Attribution's friends did likewise. They then went to search for a monastery that kept the rule of Saint Benedict without altering or abusing it, and they could not find one anywhere in France. They then decided to head to Rome, but on the way, as they were passing through Burgundy, they perchance came upon the monastery at Baume where Saint Bernard was abbot. Here they finally found a monastery that kept the rule of Saint Benedict without abusing it. Attribution then decided to give up going to Rome and to stay at Baume instead. He then sent word back to Odo in Tours, telling him about what he had found. Odo then decided to leave Tours and head to Baume, taking his library of books with him. The monastery at Baume. Odo was 30 years old when he entered Baume. When Odo arrived at Baume, some of the monks urged Odo to leave, because they warned him that Bernard was very severe. They said, "Hast thou come hither for thy soul's health to join a monastery which we for our soul's health have resolved to flee? Hast thou not heard of the severity of Bernard? Alas, alas, if thou but knewst how he treats the monks. His corrections he drives home with the whip, and those whom he whips he binds with cords. He tames their spirits in prison. He afflicts them with fasts, and even after suffering all this, the miserable monks may not obtain mercy." Odo then planned to leave, but Attribution reassured him that Bernard was a good abbot, and so Odo stayed. Odo did not continue his asceticism that he formerly followed, but it became much more mild at Baume. At Baume, Odo gained the love of Bernard by his humility. Whenever Odo was accused of a fault, he would throw himself at the feet of his accuser and beg for forgiveness. One time other monks accused Odo of breaking the rule, because he had been alone with one of the oblati, and Odo then threw himself at Bernard's feet, begging pardon. Bernard then excommunicated Odo at his feet, and Odo continued to beg for forgiveness from other monks. During meal times, the monks would listen to a reading in silence as they ate their food. Before the reading finished, they were required to collect all of their crumbs and eat them. One time, Odo was not paying attention to his crumbs, but was instead focusing on the reading, and when he finished he realized that his crumbs were all still there. The monks then immediately all went up to leave, and Odo had to go with them. But he took his crumbs in his hands and followed the monks to the chapel, where he threw himself at Bernard's feet asking pardon for his sins. Bernard asked what he had done, and Odo then held out his hands to show the crumbs, which miraculously turned into pearls. Odo then ordered for the pearls to be made into church ornaments. This rule about the crumbs was considered very important. One time, Odo related, there was a monk on his deathbed and he called for help in desperation. He said that he saw himself in front of God's judgment seat, and the devil was standing there holding a sack full of all the crumbs that this monk had not eaten, ready to accuse him before God. Odo also claimed that Bernard laid stress on two other points of Benedict's rule as well, which were that monks were not allowed to own property and that no flesh meat could be eaten. Odo said that when he first came to the monastery, other monks could not believe that he had renounced all his possessions, and they sent a monk to accompany him to go and get it back. While on their way, however, this monk died, and Odo then returned to the monastery. Odo had other stories from Baume about such punishments that fell on those who violated the rule banning the eating of flesh meat. He said that one time there was a monk who left the monastery to visit his sister, and when they gave him fish to eat, he said he was sick of it and wanted flesh and wine instead. This was then given to him, and after he took the first bite, he fell over dead. Another monk from Baume went home to his relatives for a visit and they offered him fish to eat, as he was allowed to eat under the rule. But he got angry when he saw the fish and saw a brood of chickens at his feet. He then grabbed one of the chickens and said, "Let this be my fish today," and when his friends asked if he was allowed to eat this, he said, "Fowl is not flesh, and fowl and fish have one origin and equal condition, as Ahim bears witness," and so his relatives then prepared the chicken for him, and after he bit into it, he started choking, and his relatives tried to hit him, but he then fell over dead. Berno loved Odo very much, and for all the monks who hated Berno's discipline, this meant that they then hated Odo. The head of the monks of this party was a monk named Wido. However, every time they could accuse Odo of any infraction of the rule, he would just humbly throw himself at their feet in brotherly love. Odo said that after Berno died, many of these monks left the monastery and went back to normal lives again. Odo felt like the monastery was the only safe place for people to be, and that most of the people outside of the monastery in the world were doomed to hellfire. He therefore sought to make his parents into monks, and he succeeded. Abba, his father, entered a monastery. His mother became a nun and later an abbess. His brother Bernard became a monk after his unbaptized infant son was carried away by Viking raiders. This infant was later saved and brought to Baume, where Odo baptized the child, and he died afterwards. Odo one time went away from the monastery to stay at the house of a nobleman who was himself away from home. However, the man's daughter was present and she begged Odo to save her from her approaching marriage so she could be a nun. Odo, who thought that almost everyone outside the monastery was doomed to hell, felt that he had to do something for the girl's salvation. He then took the girl back to Baume. He told Berno, and Berno was angry with him, and Odo fell at his feet asking forgiveness. Odo said to Berno, "O Lord and Father, ever from the moment that thou didst deign to receive me, a sinner, I have seen that thy sole care was the saving of souls. Other abbots may study to gain material things and please men. Thou, relying on mercy and virtue, seekst through the salvation of souls to please God alone. I wish to follow thy example in saving this virgin to the glory of thy name. For although in the end her tears overcame me, yet I was not unmindful of thy reproach. But I had rather suffer the flagellation of my holy father than be held guilty for her soul, and would that I could free all the women bound in the chains of the flesh who live in this province. And thou flagellate me for each in thy pious manner." Berno then turned away his anger and told Odo to strengthen her with holy instruction every day, so that the devil wouldn't bring her back to the world. She then went to a convent and became a nun, and died not too long afterwards. Odo was ordained to the priesthood while he was at Baume by Bishop Turpio of Limoges. Berno arranged the ordination without telling Odo, and obliged Odo under obedience to accept ordination. Odo was so depressed by this, however, that Berno sent Odo back to the bishop to visit him. Odo and the bishop talked about the evil condition of the church and all the abuses that were occurring. Odo spoke about the book of Jeremiah, and the bishop was so impressed with his words, that he asked Odo to write it down. Odo said he could not do so without first getting permission from Berno, and the bishop then got Berno's permission, and Odo then wrote down his second book, the Calationus.